Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Felton. I am an education and outreach specialist with the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. And tonight I am joined by Rebecca Golden with Bee and Bloom.
Hi.
And how are you today, Rebecca?
Doing well, thanks.
Absolutely. And so thank you for joining us tonight for our mason bee cocoon harvesting webinar. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. So we are recording tonight's webinar, and we will be posting it on the Tualatin SWCD's YouTube channel later this week. We'll also be sending up a follow-up email with everyone who's registered for the webinar this evening, and that will contain any resources that we talk about this evening, as well as a link to that recording. So if you miss anything or if you have to step away, you will have a recording of this webinar by the end of the week. After the webinar concludes, we will have a little pop-up icon for a survey. If you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to complete that, it's a big help to help us putting on these webinars. As well, if you'd like anyone that completes one of those surveys, there is an optional feature there to fill out your address. And anyone who completes one, we will send a packet of pollinator seed mix to you, and you're able to put in some pollinator habitat on any areas that you might have. Now, quickly to go over the agenda for tonight, I'll do a quick presentation to give you some background on the Tualatin SWCD, and then I'll hand it over to Rebecca, who will have a short presentation as well as a demonstration on how you can harvest mason bee cocoons. At the very end, we'll have time for a Q&A, so if you have any questions along the way, go ahead and put those in that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be able to touch base with Rebecca on those after we've finished the presentation. All right. So as I mentioned, I work for the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. The primary function of conservation districts is to work with residents of a county to help protect the natural resources there. These natural resources include water, soil, and habitat. Conservation districts are units of local government that usually are funded either through a local tax base, federal funding, or grants. Primarily, their job is to work with the community to help provide conservation throughout their lands. Now, we work with our community by providing technical assistance in the form of advice, planning support, as well as financial assistance through grants and cost share programs and through education in doing workshops and webinars just like this. Now, the Tualatin SWCD is located in Washington County, Oregon, which is just outside of Portland. By land use, our county is made up of about 15% urban environment, 35% rural, and 50% forested. Now, with all of those different land uses, there's a lot of different we have a lot of different impacts on our watershed. And we try to help implement conservation to solve or to try to treat many of those land uses and those impacts. To give you a quick background on conservation districts, because a lot of folks out there haven't heard of them. Conservation districts were founded in the 1930s. During the 30s, the US experienced a natural disaster known as the Dust Bowl. During the Dust Bowl, in the years leading up to the Dust Bowl, farmers were heavy plowing many areas, and this removed many deep-rooted plants that were holding soil in place. Now, after years of drought, this soil turned into dust. It was blown to the sky, creating essentially what's known as black blizzards across much of the middle and eastern United States. In response to this, the federal government formed the Soil Conservation Service. And today, this is known as the Natural Resource Conservation Service to help landowners better care for the land so we don't have many of these natural catastrophes that they experienced. In 1937, the federal government recognized that it was better for local groups to head up this conservation because they were more familiar with local climates, soils, waterways, you name it, and they were just more effective being led locally. Today, conservation districts exist in almost every county across the United States. So if you don't live in Washington County, I want to highly encourage you to look and find a conservation district for your own county. Another bit of context that we like to give in our webinars is talking a little bit about what a watershed is. Now, watersheds are a drainage basin. So think of it a little bit like a bathtub. All of the water that falls onto it or under it all drains in the same location. Watersheds are typically defined by the shape of the land. So those are the mountains, the slopes, any of the valleys. And as water comes down, it all drains towards the lowest point. Now, we like to talk about conservation on a watershed scale because any area that this water touches, it's all going to be connected. And because of that, many of the impacts that we have on the land affect those waters and will affect all of the natural resources connecting them. If you're in Washington County, you live in the Tualatin River watershed. And the biggest thing that I would like to kind of put out there is it's really important to remember that since we all live in a watershed, we all impact it in some way. So it's best to do what we can to help improve the health of a watershed whenever possible. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog in the background. He's enjoying himself. And finally, the real question is how do pollinators fit in watersheds, or how do they help keep healthy? Pollinators help native plants grow, and native plants are essential for a healthy watershed. Native plants are well adapted to their climate, so they have deep roots that help stabilize soil and reduce erosion, which leads to more or improved water quality. Native plants also provide better habitat for wildlife, and good habitat and lots of wildlife is an indication of a healthy ecosystem. And finally, many native plants don't need a lot of pesticides and fertilizer, which oftentimes can become pollution and will significantly reduce the health of a watershed. And with that, I will hand it over to Rebecca.
Okay, thanks so much for that introduction. So tonight, as Andrew mentioned, I'm going to start with kind of a short primer on harvesting mason bee cocoons. So we'll do kind of a zoom in presentation on what we'll be looking at. But most of the webinar today is going to be a live demo. And so we'll be able to, we're opening these tubes for the first time, so we don't know what we'll see, which is kind of exciting. Hopefully we'll have some good examples of what you do and don't want to see alike. So let me figure out how to share my screen here. I apologize for the delay. It must be this one, right? Okay, and let me see. There we go. Does that work? Is that working?
Looks great.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, so we'll start just with a brief primer on mason bees. Hopefully a lot of you have already been putting habitats up, and so you're a little bit more familiar with them, that you'll actually have cocoons and nesting trays and blocks and tubes to harvest yourself after today. But in case you're just getting started and you're kind of learning what mason bees are from the start, they are a native solitary bee to North America. There are several species of mason bee, but there are a couple that we see a lot more frequently in the Pacific Northwest and in the specifically in the Portland metro area. So this one on the bottom here is an Osmia lignaria, so that's the blue orchard mason bee. Those are the ones who are most commonly available at nurseries and are really, really prolific in this area. We've started seeing a lot more of a horn-faced mason bee or Osmia cornifrons, and the list goes on. So there are many, many different species. They all nest inside of tunnels or tubes or holes that are up off of the ground. And usually those holes are about 6 inches deep with an 8mm diameter. And so that's really just the basic habitat requirements. And with those requirements, it's pretty easy for us to provide nesting materials. And so this is the beginning of a life cycle of a mason bee. The female bees will nest and propagate her offspring inside of these little tunnels. And she'll lay the males kind of toward the front and the females toward the back. So the males are the first ones to emerge in spring, usually when temperatures just reach over 55 degrees consistently every day. That's often signaled in this area by cherries and a lot of other fruit trees beginning to bloom. But they'll emerge and they'll start to nectar feed, and they'll wait for the females to start emerging as well. And once those females do emerge, they'll mate. And then it's a predominantly female-dominated world for the rest of the season. And so once mated, the females will forage for nectar and pollen. She'll get pollen grains kind of all over the messy hairs on her head and on her abdomen. And so she has a few scopae or pollen collecting hairs on her thorax as well, kind of behind her head. But she'll bring that back to her nesting site. She'll go all the way toward the back, and she'll groom it off with her front legs and make this kind of sticky pollen ball called bee bread at the back of the nest. And then she'll lay an egg on it. And towards the back of the nest, in the first eggs that she'll usually lay female eggs, which are fertilized eggs. And then she'll seal up that little cavity with a mud wall. So she'll go out and gather mud and carry it back kind of with her big developed mandibles. And she's a mason. She'll use her masonry skills to build off a little sectional. And so she'll repeat that process, and she'll usually do about half female eggs and half male eggs. And then she'll put a thick mud capping right at the end of the tube, and then she will eventually die. And that's the end of her season. Mason bee season usually only goes through the end of May and sometimes in early June. But the rest of the season, you have the larvae and the young developing inside of the nest. And so for a mason bee, most of their life is actually going to take place as a juvenile. And so once that egg hatches, the larvae will consume all of the food left behind by their mother. They'll spin a little cocoon once they're large enough inside of that cell, and then they'll pupate. And when they pupate, they'll kind of reach their full adult form in October, and then they'll hibernate as that adult inside of their cocoon for the entire winter. And so that's when we want to harvest our mason bees, is when they're no longer kind of in that vulnerable juvenile stage. They're fully formed adults, and they're pretty hardy. They're ready to hibernate. And this is what your tubes should look like this time of year. And at the end of the season, you can see that kind of thick mud cap at the end facing outwards. And so that's the signal that she completely, or that your mason bees for each one of those little tubes completely filled up her nest, and she completed her purpose for the season. And that's what's happening inside. So you have your mason bees have spun their cocoons, and they are fully formed adults inside of that cocoon. And you can still see the mud walls that are completely separating each one of those little cocoons from the other. And so now we'll talk about harvesting. And you may be asking, why would we even bother harvesting cocoons? So it is a normal part of their life cycle to kind of go through this whole development process and to be that hibernating bee inside of the cocoon. In nature, they would stay inside of that nest, and then once temperatures rose and got warm enough again, they would be triggered to chew their way out and join the workforce for that season. In an urban environment, or when we kind of create these artificial nesting structures, so a man-made structure like this, it's really geared towards allowing many, many bees to nest in a dense aggregation. And so you have several tubes or holes all close together, and that really encourages your bee populations to proliferate, but it also provides a lot of space for their common pests and disease to take over. And in particular, there are some invasive pests that we want to keep an eye out for because within a matter of 2 to 3 years, they can really decimate your bee populations and knock them back. And so rather than growing and having a larger bee population by giving them more nesting habitat, you're really only keeping a small number of the bee population alive, and you're allowing more of the pests and diseases to proliferate and sometimes spread to natural nesting sites and to other people's artificial nesting sites. And so for the sake of your own bee population and for the sake of the wild bee population in the area, it's really important to kind of monitor everything that's going on in that area. And the best way to do that is to harvest your cocoons, clean them, discard, separate all of the pests and disease cocoons, and then store the good and healthy cocoons in a temperature controlled environment through the winter. And the best temperature controlled environment for this we've found is actually just straight in your refrigerator. So hopefully you have a little bit of space for them there. But a pre-season note, and something that can dramatically decrease your pest population, is when you actually notice that your female mason bees have finished up their nests and they have that thick mud cap at the end, it's a good time to remove them from the habitat. And you can actually store them in an organza bag. You could use something that breathes like a pillowcase or nylon stockings or an old sock, whatever you have lying around that breathes and that you can then keep somewhere in ambient temperature. So like in a garage or in a shed, or somewhere that still has kind of that normal outdoor temperature for the rest of the summer and until October. Okay. So harvesting them is going to vary a little bit depending on the nesting materials that you have. I have examples of the 3 most common types of nesting materials that you can actually harvest from with me for the demo today. But often you'll see kind of these standard cardboard tubes. They unravel just like a paper towel tube, but there are other types that I'll show you in depth. But basically the idea is you'll open up the nests, remove the cocoons, separate them from debris and any diseased or pest-ridden bees from that population. And then you'll wash them in cold water. So it's important to note that you want to do everything kind of in cool temperature. So in a cool room, or if you can do them outside, if it's not rainy, and then rinse them in cold water because if it's too warm, it can actually trigger your bees to emerge early. So that's something to look out for. And we actually will usually put about a capful of bleach in for every gallon of cold water that we use, and that helps clean off any fungal infections that they may have. And then once you rinse them, you'll allow them to dry as much as possible before putting them into a container for storage. And the best containers for storage will have a little bit of ventilation. So I've put a picture here of a product that is specifically marketed for this, but it's basically a clamshell takeout container. It's all plastic, but it has a little sponge in the bottom with holes in the top. I'll show you what we use, but it's basically just Tupperware with holes poked in the top, and then I have a paper towel in the bottom. So it works perfectly fine for us. And so usually it's something you can DIY with what you already have lying around, and you don't have to spend money on a takeout container. Or you could spend money on a takeout container, but get the food. All right, so a couple of things I want to point out before we actually crack into our own tubes and our own nests of what we'll be looking out for. So we'll keep an eye out for pinholing. So we'll look for holes that are actually in the outsides of the tubes, and we'll look for holes that are in the cocoons themselves. You may notice in the picture here on the bottom left that it has kind of this buildup of brown material on the outside. That's just mason bee frass, and it's nothing to be concerned about, but the holes themselves that are in that picture, you'll want to keep an eye out for, and then we would actually discard a cocoon that looked like that. But the frass may look alarming if you don't know what you're looking at, but totally healthy and normal. And a good thing that they didn't spin it into the cocoon with them. And then we'll look for parasitic wasp larvae or even adult parasitic wasps. Sometimes you can find that they've gotten in there to lay their eggs and then they've perished inside of the mason bee nest. So actually seeing the adults themselves is pretty rare, but it is kind of a warning sign that you'll want to look more closely at the tubes and the cocoons that are nearby to make sure they haven't been parasitized. We will be looking out for beetle larvae. Diseased cocoons will often kind of have that C shape, and those are usually fungal diseases where they look almost kind of mummified and shriveled. So anything like that we would discard. And then pollen mites. Getting rid of them isn't necessarily super important, but it can indicate why you haven't had a bee that developed in that slot or in that location. We will kind of rinse them off and keep them separated, but they're of no threat anymore at that point. I've already eaten all of the bee food, so the bee couldn't develop. But yeah, so it is kind of a little bit of sleuthing and checking out what actually happened inside of your tunnels, your nesting trays all season. All right, and then the invasive pests that we really need to look out for now are called Hunidi flies. So these Hunidi flies are what we call kleptoparasitic, and so that means the adult female will come in, she'll lay eggs in the mason bee nest, and then when those eggs hatch, the fly larvae will eat all of the food that was supposed to be left behind for that developing bee. And then the crazy thing is that that adult fly can actually re-emerge from the nest. They have these expanding organs on the tops of their heads that kind of blast their way through this mud wall. And then they're able to do the same thing to any other nesting holes or nesting tombs in that same habitat. And they can be incredibly prolific and take over an area quite quickly. And they're pretty recent here in the Pacific Northwest. They were first observed in 2017, and they've become more and more common very quickly. And without being watched, it is estimated that they can overtake a mason bee habitat in about 3 years. And so we'll definitely want to get rid of any cocoons or any areas that have those Houdini fly larvae in them. And so we'll make sure to discard any that look like that. Okay, so now I'm actually going to switch to the demo itself. And I'm going to adjust my camera so that we can actually take a closer look at what's happening inside of those tubes. Oh yes, this way. This is new use of technology for me, so I apologize if it seems less than smooth, but we are learning greatly this year in the world of webinars and remote content. So like I mentioned, I'm not entirely sure what I will find here today, so this is kind of exciting. And I actually, one thing you can do if you'd like is wear gloves for this process. I'm going to do so on one hand because I have a kitchen wound on my thumb. But it is sometimes a good call if you don't want to get dirty. Okay, so I'm going to start with the standard mason bee tube. This is cardboard. This is the 6-inch, 8mm diameter tubes. They come standard in a lot of homes or houses that you purchase, and these are incredibly readily available. And so I'm just going to start at the top, and I'm going to unravel just like I would a paper towel tube. And as I do this, there are going to be mud walls falling, and hopefully cocoons. But yeah, all right. Starting to find some bees. And it isn't always super easy to get these paper towel like tubes or these cardboard tubes to unravel. And one thing you can do is actually soak them in cool water for a second so they're a little bit softer and easier to handle. That's totally up to you. Okay. And I'm just gonna set the unraveled cardboard, I keep calling it a paper towel tube, the unraveled cardboard tube aside, and that will actually end up in the compost. And here I've come across something a little bit interesting to see. And so this actually shows pollen mites. So pollen mites infested this particular mason bee juvenile, or the juvenile's food, so it never actually developed properly. And so that's what we're looking at here. It kind of looks like hairy or like little granules of orange. And so those are those pollen mites. They look an awful lot like what they eat. And all of that cardboard that you're discarding can be added to your compost. So that's good to note. And I think I'm at the end of this particular tube. So let's take a closer look at what we have. And so we did notice that there were pollen mites infecting one cocoon, and then we have a few larger ones here. So these are the female developing bees. Here's another one. And it looks like there are 3 male cocoons. They're a little bit smaller. And I'm just gonna kind of brush the mud or the leftovers of that mud debris off of them. And so here they are. And I'm going to take a little bit of a closer look at them. And then if I find anything of note, I'll make sure to point it out. Thanks. So all of these, or this one so far, looks perfect. I'm not seeing any signs of holes. I'm not seeing any parasitic wasp larvae or Hunidi fly larvae. So besides just that one instance of pollen mites, looks like we have a perfectly good set of bee cocoons here. And so I'm going to move them off to the side and then open my next nest. All right, so the next type I will open is a natural reed. And so this reed also has that about 8 millimeter diameter and then 6-inch depth. And these are a little bit trickier to open. You kind of have to crack it and then pry it apart. You can use a knife to get started kind of at the edge that has that mud capping on it. I'm going to kind of press it at the end here until it cracked. And now I am going to pry it apart. Okay. We've got a nice little nest going on here. Mason bees love natural reeds and natural materials. It has kind of a rough exterior, and so it's tactile and it's specific to their nest. And when they go back to the nest aggregation, it's usually very easy for them to locate. And it looks like we have a very similar situation to the last tube, but it's kind of nice. You can look at everything intact still with the mud walls here, but you can see there is one instance right here of pollen mites, and then we've got male cocoons and female cocoons. And so I'm just going to remove these from the nest, do a quick look over to make sure they haven't been parasitized or there's no pinholing, and I'm going to add them to the bees from the last nest. Okay. So in case you're wondering how I know between the males and females, there's a pretty good size discrepancy, and also based on the positioning where they were in the nest. And so the ones toward the back are usually female, the ones towards the front are male, but even side by side, I don't know if you can really tell from this angle, but one is quite a bit larger. So this one in the front, that female is quite a bit larger from that male, and it should be a pretty striking difference. You don't have to keep them separated or anything like that during cleaning, but it is nice to know what your male to female ratio is for when you're starting over next spring. Okay, and so I'm gonna go back to a cardboard tube. So this particular set of cardboard tubes I gathered from a nest when I noticed that they had the mud capping over the top, but the nest itself, or the whole habitat, was covered in parasitic wasps. And so that was a pretty good signal to me that there was an infestation problem. And sure enough, when I pulled the tubes out, and if you look closely here, if we can get it to focus. Well, basically what I'm seeing, oh cool, is little pinholes in the tube itself. And so parasitoid wasps, does that show up? Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, cool. So parasitoid wasps have very, very long ovipositors on the backs of their abdomens. And so they use these long ovipositors to inject their eggs into their target or their prey organism. And so some parasitic wasps will parasitize caterpillars or soft-bodied insects that are free living out in the world. And some have specialized to actually find the nests of the species that they target and then infect the young while they're still developing in the nest. It's a pretty good strategy. And based on the number of wasps I was seeing in that aggregation that day, they'd found it relatively quickly, because it was probably the first week of June, which is pretty early still for mason bees to be wrapping up. But we'll see how these bees fared. So I'm just going to unravel that cardboard just like I did on that first example. And as I do, I'm just going to place the cocoons off to the side. This one is interesting to me so far. It seems like there are an awful lot of males. Sometimes your adult female mason bee will lay a heavier ratio of males or females. And that is an area that I don't understand the dynamics of entirely. So Here we are. And I think that's probably it. Oh, we have more pollen mites. And it's the last cocoon. Just kidding, there was one more hiding in there. They were all really crammed in. This is a very prolific female. She laid a lot. Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, so I'm going to take a closer look here. Actually, so far, these look okay. They have some frass on the outside, but that is to be expected. They do look a little bit paler. Oh yeah, here we go. So this one has a sizable hole right at the top. And it's just a little pinhole right at the tip of that cocoon there. And so this one I'm going to separate and we will discard so you're not keeping the infected cocoons with the rest of our bee population for the year. And sometimes it is helpful to kind of move or separate that dust or kind of brush them off to get a closer look at the cocoon themselves. Here we have another with a hole in it. So that one's going to be discarded as well. Moving it off to the side. Okay. Well, before I kind of do a full scouring of the rest of these cocoons, I'd like to dive into opening a different type of nest. So we have a variety of nesting materials all side by side in the same area. And so we use trays or blocks that can be opened. We use the cardboard, we use natural reeds, and usually we get a pretty good dispersal of female mason bees nesting in all different types. But this year we didn't see a lot of activity in our trays themselves, which is a little bit of a bummer because they are definitely the easiest ones to open and to clean, but we'll give them a pass. So, another thing that I'd kind of like to point out is that in your habitats, you will probably see many different species of bee in this family. And so the family is Megachilidae, and so those will be your mason bees, your leaf cutting bees. You'll see bees called resin bees. And so you'll have a whole range of bees nesting in tunnels, especially if you're providing a range of tube sizes, which we do recommend because you are supporting a greater diversity of bees, which is in general better for a wider array of native plants. But I'd like to kind of point out, so we saw that thick mud capping that kind of signals a mason bee, and this one here is a little resin bee. And so they tend to nest in tubes or holes that are smaller in diameter than most mason bees, but they'll gather kind of sticky resins as their nesting materials, and that's how they separate their larvae in their little chambers that will develop. And so for these ones, we've found that it's incredibly difficult to open the tubes with all that sticky resinous nesting material in it. And so we usually let these ones overwinter in their cocoons themselves, and we don't refrigerate them either. We'll actually add these and keep these with our leaf cutter bees. And so before we wrap up today, I'll kind of talk about next steps for leaf cutting bees as well. They nest in a similar manner, but we don't actually harvest their cocoons until spring of next year. But you might also see a range of wasp species nesting in your habitats. So here we had grass-carrying wasps, and so you can see the nesting material, or the things that separate cocoons here, are all going to be kind of a jumble or fronds of dried grass. And their cocoons are much more delicate looking than mason bees. And sometimes you can see remnants of the prey that the mother fed to their young. There's a little grasshopper in here. These are not going to hurt your bees at all, and they're actually rather beneficial to have in the environment. They are predator species, and so there are usually not that many of them in a given area, but they will eat garden pests a lot of the time as well. And so they're good insects, good beneficial insects to keep around, though they are not bees, but they're closely related. And then as I'm looking in this nest as well, I'm noticing a lot of pollen mites in places where I would hope to see cocoons. And so really that's that for our nesting trays this year. But generally what we would do is scrape the cocoons out of the little grooves of the channels. We really like to use chopsticks. It tends to be really the best tool for the job. And there are a couple of cocoons in here, and as I pull them out and look, I notice quite a bit of pinholing and misshapen ones. So this one here is, it looks basically eaten. There's nothing inside. And so that really does indicate that this particular nesting tray just didn't see the best year. And that's okay. You win some and you lose some. All right, so I'm gonna set that off to the side. And we're still doing okay on time. So I would like to open up some tubes that came from an area where we did see Hunidi fly activity. So hopefully we'll be able to find some Hunidi fly larvae so you know what to avoid. And here I'm opening up a natural reed again, and I'm going to, I cracked it just with a squeeze, and then I'm going to pry it open to take a look. Oh yeah. Here we go. You know, it's funny, I don't generally hope to see these things, but for the purposes of demonstration, it's really exciting. So it's kind of a new fun way to look at it. All right, so here are Hunidi wasp larvae. I'm sorry, Hunidi fly. All right. And so this we will separate and discard. And this frass here is also left behind by the fly larvae. And so that is an indication of an infestation as well. Yeah, it is it's noodle-like. It's a kind of hair consistency. But it does look like still there are a couple of cocoons in here that are good and that are viable. And so I'm gonna brush them off and just take a quick peek, make sure they're okay, and I'll add them to my pile. All right, so we've seen really all of the common pests that you might see. We didn't see dermestid beetles, but they kind of look like incredibly small mealworms and their larvae inside. And there is that picture in the presentation for you to refer to again. But anytime you see small and little congregations of small larvae like this while you're opening your mason bee cocoons, it's a good idea just to separate them and to discard them. Okay, so while we have time, I'll kind of demo washing the cocoons. And so I have just a pot of cold water. that I will dunk all of my harvested cocoons into. So I will just pick them up and put them in. And I'm doing this around a lot of electronics, so I'm going to be very careful. And I'm just kind of going to swirl them around and give them a good rinse. You can do this by hand, or you can use like a slotted spoon or a strainer, and you can stir it up, kind of swirl them around and give them a good rinse. And this cold water too, we do recommend adding a small amount of bleach so you have a very dilute bleach solution. And then once you scoop them out, or you can scoop them out by hand or with a spoon, whatever you feel good about, I'm going to set them just on a layer of paper towels off to the side here. In a single layer. I don't want my wet cocoons to be like on top of each other too much. And then one other thing to note, so all of my cocoons in here are floating. And so they're floating at the top. And if I had cocoons that sunk to the bottom, I would discard those as well as non-viable. Okay. And it's very simple and something you can do in a bucket. You can do it outside, anywhere that's a little bit cooler in temperature. And then once they're all dry, you'll want to store them in a container or in a situation that has some ventilation to put in the refrigerator. And so this is, like I said, just a Tupperware container with paper towels in the bottom, and then the lid has holes poked into it. And this, I would say, is, I think the small nail was used to poke these holes, but you could use anything. And I would do a few per side, and maybe a couple down the middle as well. So when my cocoons are dry, I'll place them in as thin of a layer as possible in the bottom here, and then cover it and store them in the refrigerator through the winter until spring, when temperatures are above that 55 degrees again. And then I'll replace them in the habitat from the previous year. Something else we've started doing is actually uninstalling our habitats themselves, or the houses, the woodenware, or the structures that we're using, and bringing them inside so that they're protected from weather. And that just extends the shelf life of your house. And so you'll have your cocoons in hibernation inside of the fridge, and then you'll have your houses stored, and then you can go through hanging them and putting them back up again in the springtime. And then it's time to release your cocoons. Usually, I think I mentioned this several times, I apologize, like I'm a broken record, but when temperatures are above 55 degrees again every day, when the cherries start to bloom. So here, that's usually early April. Okay, so I think I have a good amount of time for question and answer. And if there aren't a lot of questions, I can always open more tubes and see what we find. So whatever people are feeling like.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. That was so cool to see in person. That was just amazing.
Cool. I'm glad.
That's great. So we do have a couple of questions. So if folks have any more questions, feel free just to go ahead and pop those into the Q&A. And we'll just start from the top and work our way on down. So the first question we have is, their laying was dramatically reduced this year compared to last year, yet circumstances were the same. Their newly hatched bees vanished quite quickly this year before filling the tubes like last year. Any suggestions on what might have caused that problem?
So nest retention for your new adult mason bees is always a little bit of a gamble. So there are some bees that just kind of have it hardwired in them to disperse. And so they'll emerge from their habitat and then they are off to spread their genetics and to establish nesting sites somewhere else. And there's not a lot we can do to prevent that, but there are a couple of tricks to increasing your nest retention. Sometimes that can be having a couple of satellite houses put up in different places. And so you can have some nests with tubes in other locations on your property so that when they disperse, they'll find those spots and move in rather than having them all kind of in one house or one central location. You can also use a kind of release chamber. And so when placing your cocoons in your habitat, if they emerge right into the bright light, their instinct to disperse tends to be a little bit more dramatic than if it's dark when they emerge and there's just one source of light that they can go to come out of. And so these release chambers, what we've done in the past is just had little cardboard boxes with a small hole in them. And so we'll put all of the cocoons in a little box into the nesting site with just one point for them to emerge from. So they're still emerging into the dark and then coming out through that small point of light. And usually that can increase your nest retention and get them to nest and move into the tubes that they're near when they come out. Cool.
Very cool. All right. Next question. First off, they want to thank you for the great demonstration and info. They were wondering if you've seen any long, about 1 inch light pink worm-like larvae in your nest. They hadn't seen them in previous years, but last year they had a bunch. They were really active and fast-moving and gross. Any ideas what they might be?
That's interesting. I actually haven't come across that. It does. So my business partner Emily is here. She was helping me with all of the cameras and stuff. She's also a super knowledgeable entomologist, and so she was saying, well, I wonder if it's, you know, if it could possibly be earthworms. So if your tubes got damp and the earthworms found it or moved in. It doesn't sound terribly familiar to me, though. I wonder if you snapped any photos of this or took any pictures. And so that's always my first instinct. I like to pretend like I know everything and like I'm carrying everything around in my head all of the time. But most of the time what happens is I'm seeing something completely weird and that I've never experienced before, and I'm just taking pictures and then going on Bug Guide to try to figure out what I saw later. And Emily also is basically a bug guide. And so if you take pictures and send them our way, we may or may not be able to help you with a more concrete identification of what's going on. But from the description, it's hard to know. And I have more follow-up questions still. So were these larvae in the mason bee tubes, or the ones that were capped off and had mud walls and had been nested in by females, or if they moved into empty ones? So it could be just another insect that likes to nest in a long dark tube that just moved in and did its own thing. So it may or may not have been a parasite or just something else entirely that moved into the habitat. But we'd be totally happy to look into that further.
Sometimes you get more questions than answers.
Yeah.
And I will, Rebecca will be CC'd on the follow-up email for you, so you will all have her direct contact information after with that follow-up email.
Awesome.
Okay, so the next question, how do you discard the parasites like the Hunidi fly? Do you squish them? Do you freeze them?
I just throw them straight into the trash.
There you go. That's nice and easy.
Freezing is better practice. And before you hit that step, you could even freeze and then compost. But yeah, there's not really a surefire method. I wouldn't recommend squishing them. Okay. That is not a tactile experience I would wish on anyone. So
understandable.
Even opening this, they're sticky. it's not fun to touch. It's gross. So
Makes sense. All right, the next question. Do you place the cocoons in the new tubes when you reinstall them in the spring?
So when you're releasing the cocoons, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to put them into the tubes themselves before they come out, especially because once they've been handled, you don't know who's going to emerge first. And so what you may end up having, is the ones at the front are a little bit more slower to emerge, and the ones that are trying to chew their way out can't make their way through. So that's just a little bit more difficult to control than in their natural system, where you have the small males at the front that are getting the sun for longer periods of time, and they're just more primed to come out faster, and they'll have that kind of progression as they go through the tubes. But I would say the best way to re-release them is to have some kind of a release chamber, like I described, like that little box with a hole in it. Otherwise, what you can do, so some mason bee houses or habitats have little attic spaces or little shelves kind of above their nesting materials or the nesting tubes, and you can put the cocoons all the way in the back of the habitat on that shelf, so that when they emerge, they can come back down. You can put them, I would recommend, just at the back of your habitat, where they're not an easy meal for birds that are swooping by. So you want them to be somewhat inaccessible, but further back into the dark of the habitat, and just on top of your nesting materials is where they'll start emerging.
Nice. That sounds relatively easy.
Okay, good.
All right, next question. Have you ever used dry sand to clean your cocoons?
I haven't, but I've heard of that method. It's just an abrasive instead of water. And that's something that people will do when they're harvesting leafcutter bees, because their cocoons are not hydrophobic. And so you can't rinse them. So some people will do a dry rinse. It just is a little bit less effective than using something like a dilute bleach solution for getting rid of the fungal infections.
Great. Another question, is it best to remove the tubes as soon as they are capped with mud? And if so, are they fine to keep in the house, or do you need to store them elsewhere until you clean them?
So I would remove them as soon as you see that cap and get them into that kind of mesh breathable bag structure that can't be accessed by your larvae. Or by, for adult parasitoids like Hunidi Flies or wasps to get in. And then I would keep them at outdoor ambient temperatures if you can. So if you have like a garage or a shed, that's best. But you can bring them in and put them in a window. So they can be in the house, but you do want them to stay warm during that part of the season, because the larvae are still very active inside of their tunnels, and changing their body temperature too much can disrupt their development. So you really want it to be as natural of a temperature as possible. So if it's like really hot out and you have them in a window, maybe move them away from the window. So that's just kind of the rule of thumb, is just to try to keep it as natural as possible to what their outdoor habitat was experiencing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Absolutely makes sense.
Cool.
So a couple questions that are relatively similar together. So I'm going to read both of them for you. So the first one was, what do you do with the wasps, worms, and the other? And the other question is, how do you discard the fly and wasp larvae? Do they need to be destroyed?
Right. So just like I mentioned earlier, there really isn't too much of a handling issue. So for flies in particular, they'll still develop, they'll pupate, and they'll become adult flies unless you freeze them. So for the matter of keeping them away from the rest of your bees, like, you can throw them in the trash, but I guess for the purposes of eliminating pests entirely, giving it a good freeze before discarding them in the compost or in the trash is good practice.
Great. You already touched base a little bit on it, but I'll just ask again in case you have anything else to add.
Okay.
How do you properly release the cocoons in the spring? Open the Tupperware box in above 55-degree weather, or?
Yeah, so I would remove them from the Tupperware box and place your cocoons in with your nesting materials. So like I mentioned before, just as far back in the habitat as possible. So I have a habitat here. I would basically stick them on top of the tubes as far back as I could, and then hang it for them to come out. Some houses have specific regions designed like that attic with the shelf where you can put them. So those are just kind of the bonus features of the habitat if you're looking to purchase or construct one. Or you can put them in a release chamber at the back of the habitat on top of your nesting materials.
Great. And you already touched on this question about releasing in the spring. Another question was, they have a very old mason bee house, which is just a wood block with holes drilled in, so no cardboard tubes. Bees have been using the holes consistently for many years, and they see them hatch and then mud the holes in again. However, there's no way for them to clean out the holes. Should they wait until they hatch in the spring and then discard the houses altogether? They don't want to spread any disease or pest problems. And they really enjoyed your presentation.
Awesome, I'm so glad. So that is a really common a thing that we hear. So what you can do, and it's basically exactly what you just recommended yourself, is to allow them to emerge and then replace the habitat. But the best way to do that without, and keeping them from re-nesting in the same habitat, is to put it into a paper bag underneath the new habitats that you already have set up. And so you can open up the paper bag a little bit so that there's some light coming in, but they'll fly out of it, they'll go toward the light, and then they'll find the new nesting site rather than re-nesting in that same location that you can't clean.
And that's a similar setup to what I have at my house, and I've seen it worked a couple of years now. So I can attest to that working pretty well.
Awesome.
All righty. Another question is, what is the best way to store cocoons to avoid mildew?
Right. So keeping them, so I would let them dry as much as possible before you put them into the storage container, and then keep them in a thin layer so they're not on top of each other. So the best way to do that really is to get as long and skinny of a container as you can, and still have them in just one or two layers so that they don't build up mold. However, we've had moldy cocoons be viable. And so if you see a little bit of mold in your storage container, what you could do is remove them, give them another rinse, and then restore them in a thinner layer, and just make sure you have holes poked into the container itself for some ventilation. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and anything with mildew is just keeping it as dry as possible for as long as you can. You know, that's kind of my general rule in anything that I've been doing or trying to avoid mildew. So it makes sense.
Exactly.
A question of, can you feed the discarded cocoons and pests to chickens?
Oh yeah.
I'm sure your chickens would absolutely love those. So that's a great way to keep it keep the life cycle moving on your property.
Awesome.
Another question, can you time your release with the blossoming of your particular fruit trees? How do you remove tubes from a store-bought mason bee house? They seem to be attached pretty securely.
Right, so you can absolutely time out the release of your bees based on the blooms that you have that you're trying to pollinate. Sometimes we'll do ours in waves, so we'll hit the different flowering trees in the orchard with a different workforce. And so we'll put some out when cherries go, and then apples, and then plums, and that seems to have worked really well for us. When you do that, I would just try to make sure you have a decent male to female ratio. If you can have like a 60% male to 40% female ratio with your releases at each time, that's going to have the best mating results happen. So Beyond that, yeah, you can release them whenever you want, and you can do it in phases. I would just make sure that you got a good gender ratio.
Nice. And especially being able to see the different sizes of those cocoons as you were looking at earlier, that's a really nice, clear way to be able to determine what your ratio is going to look like. So I was glad that you had the video to show that.
Yeah, me too. And then I think you were mentioning a habitat that had holes that weren't able to be removed. That's essentially going to be the same issue as just having the drilled holes in a wood block. And so if you do have bees that nested in it, you're not going to be able to harvest them. And that's okay for this year. It's just not something you want to have for an extended period of time. So I would just recommend trying to replace that habitat, but then get them to emerge from that dark paper bag container so that they're not re-nesting in the holes that can't be harvested from.
Great. Another question was, they had 7 filled parchment paper tubes of mason bees and 6 were infested with dead earwigs. And it sounds like their little mason bee cocoons were actually dry and the bees were dead in the 7th. Any suggestions?
Yeah, so the earwigs, they're what we call, I think they're detritivores, aren't they? So they'll come clean up dead material. And so it's not the earwigs themselves that cause the problem, but they're drawn to the problem. And so it sounds like if you had dried up and dead or emaciated looking cocoons, you probably had chalk brood or stone brood or some kind of fungal infection that happened. And for that, I would recommend, I would, I guess, wonder if they had moisture, too much moisture in the environment. And sometimes that's just the luck of the draw. And if you have one set that catches those kinds of fungal spore diseases, they'll spread to the other ones. And that's just kind of the unfortunate reality of having a lot of bees all nesting in the same area. It might not have been a moisture problem at all, but one way to prevent those fungal infections is from having an extra dry location for them.
Great. There's a comment a person made was they thought that they needed humidity to store mason bee cocoons, but it sounds like that mildew would be a problem if they did that.
So they will need to have some humidity. And the mildew, it's not really a problem, but it is undesirable to have in your refrigerator, which is totally understandable. And so it's just kind of a matter of keeping an eye on it. So your paper towel in the bottom, and I'm sorry I didn't mention this earlier, you should have it kind of misted before you put everything in. And then just having them in a single layer should prevent too much mildew buildup or anything like that from happening.
Cool.
But yeah, you do need to have some level of humidity in there as well to keep them from desiccating. And so it is all kind of a balance. Cool, sorry, we had a package delivery.
No worries. Great, they said thank you, that helps clarify.
Okay, cool.
Last question that we have thus far, does this person leave the grass carrying was cocoons alone when clearing my mason bee nests?
Yeah, so I would leave them. So that was when I opened up the trays, we had the wasp cocoons that were nesting in there, and then they had that kind of grassy material in between. I would leave them alone. I would leave them outside for the winter, just let them kind of complete their natural life cycle. And then those newly formed adults will come out again in their active season, which I think is usually like June, July. And so, yeah, I would leave them alone.
There you go.
Awesome.
Not a question, but another thank you for the very informative class. They really enjoyed seeing the live examples and removing the cocoons from the tubes. So thank you again. And they're a first year mason bee house person. So they're really looking forward to trying it out this year.
Oh, yay. I'm so glad. Yeah, thank you for putting this on and for including us. This is exciting to share.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the questions that we have thus far. If anyone thinks of any questions afterwards, like I mentioned, you will have both Rebecca and my email addresses from that follow-up email. So feel free to reach on out. Both of us are here to help answer any questions that you might have. And please don't be a stranger. So thank you again, Rebecca. That was a really great presentation. I really enjoyed it. And thank you all for joining us this evening.
Be well.
Exactly.